welcome everyone to the third day of CoLLAs. You were right in waking up early because we have a great first speaker today. So Jay McClelland. So he has a formal training in cognitive psychology. And so he's not only an expert in artificial neural networks, but also in the human brain and connections between these two. And from the title of his talk, that's also some of the stuff he's going to talk about. So I think that will be very exciting. Jay McClelland is an authority in this field and probably most famous for his book, DPD, like the distributed parallel processing. You may have read that or heard about that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Jay, the floor is yours.
Good morning. So the introduction was about right about my background, but I want to stress, and so you understand where I'm coming from, that fundamentally, I started using neural networks to essentially understand my own perceptual experience and the results of experiments that I did as a PhD student on human subjects, and you know, to model the process of thinking in the human mind. And little to my expectation or you know, desire necessarily, these models have turned out to be useful for artificial systems, which is in some ways a delight. But it always makes it so that my purpose and that of my audience is not necessarily always the same. That is to say, my goal is to build an understanding of the actual way the human mind thinks. And I guess that's a little bit useful for AI because there's still ways in which we're, you know, we have some advantages over our machines still. So that's useful to think about what they are and to understand them better. But I'm also going to tell you about things that, you know, align with my way of thinking about what both the strengths, but also the limitations of the human mind are, what its characteristics are that differ from, let's say, what we could do with a huge machine with billions and billions of GPUs in it. And we're going to start with what I think is one of the most important challenges facing AI today, but also my effort to understand how the human brain learns, because I'm using artificial intelligence style neural networks as models of human learning, but they've got a severe deficiency. They can be impressive, but they consume approximately 100,000 times more data than any human being could be exposed to in their lifetime in order to achieve their competences. And, you know, one of the things that's come out recently and is probably becoming more and more prominent, I think, is that this may be in partly due to the fact that what they learn generalizes really, really poorly in some cases. So this was revealed in the last year or so by this interesting paper about something called the reversal curse. How many people here are familiar with the reversal curse? Oh, only a couple of you. Okay, so I think this is actually very important, and I'm going to come back to it 2 or 3 times in the talk. So this was discovered by asking questions to GPT-4, question like, who is Tom Cruise's mother? And that GPT-4 would answer, Mary Lee Pfeiffer. And but when they asked the model, well, does Mary Lee Pfeiffer have a son? Who is she the mother of? The model said, we don't have any information about that. Sorry, there's no information in our databases about that question. So this is a fact, right? That there's a relationship between a man and a person who's his mother, and somehow or other we would expect an intelligent agent to, if they know one version of this sentence, they should know the other. The reversal curse also shows up when you fine-tune large language models. The paper went on to show this. So if you fine tune the model with synthetic facts like Brian Smith is the father of Fred Jones, the LLM show no increased tendency, absolutely nothing, right? Compared to not having seen that before when you ask them to complete Fred Jones's father is with Brian Smith. They just don't know the answer. So this is something that is a known problem now about large language models. And it's something that I think ought to be worth addressing. And I'm going to share with you a slightly different problem in which something showing the contrast between what we find that at least some human beings can learn from a small amount of exposure to a very limited range of data that generalizes in a way that's intelligent. Seems like, yeah, if you learned that, you should be able to generalize that. So let's take a look at that. It's something that my student, Andrew Nam, studied as a first-year graduate student in the cognitive psychology program at Stanford with me. He recruited humans with no prior experience with Sudoku. And he showed them grids like the one that you see here on the slide. And each subject was walked through a tutorial describing that used a single example, like the one here, describing how to determine which one of two, what we call candidate digits, is the one that has to go in the green cell of this blue column. So the logic of this is that, in Sudoku, every row, column, or 3x3 box has to have one instance of each of the digits between 1 and 9. And so if you have a cell and you have a digit that you know can't go anywhere else in the column, then it has to go here because it's got to go somewhere. So in this case, you might consider first the digit 9 and as a possible candidate. And you can see, well, it can't go in any of these cells because there's already a 9 in this box. It can't go here because there's already a 9 intersecting with this row. But it could go there. So we can't be sure it has to go in the green cell. On the other hand, the 2 can't go in any of those or that one either. So it must be the digit that goes in the green cell. Okay, so I've just walked you through the tutorial to how to solve this problem. All the problems had a similar structure. They always had 3 digits already in the column, and they always had these 2 digits that occurred 3 times outside of the column. So in some ways, it's a very limited kind of example, but they also were even more narrowly defined than that for the sake of understanding whether the skill was generalizable, in that each subject only saw examples with a single target cell. That's this target. For this subject, it would be this green cell with a single target house type, either a row or a column, and with a subset of the digits as possible solutions, okay? Well, in this case, the digits 2 and 9 were in the set of digits that could be possible solutions. And there were 2 others, and then there were 4 other digits that were held out as for transfer testing, okay? So after the tutorial with, let's say, this exact example, the subject would see 25 more examples with the same highlighted cell, same highlighted column, different distribution of the digits around in the display, subject to the constraints that I mentioned. And they would practice these examples. And if they made a mistake, we would give them explanatory feedback. We'd say, no, like, for example, if they tried to put a 7 in the green cell, we would say, no, the 7's already in the column. If they tried to put that 9 in the green cell, we'd say, no, that could go in another cell, so it can't be the one that has to go here. So they got explanatory feedback. Now, what we found was that a subset of the participants, that we called solvers, get the idea after 0 to 10 practice trials. Some of them got it just from the explanation. Only a few did that. Few, made a couple, 3 mistakes, and then, okay, it clicks in. And we fit these little, Markov decision process models to this, and can fit the trajectories of these people. Now, it's not true that everybody was a solver. In the set of people we recruited through Mechanical Turk, only a third were solvers. We had filtered out anybody who could solve a really, really tiny Sudoku puzzle in advance, or who attested to ever having solved Sudoku before. So these are probably people who don't like puzzles by and large. So I'm not saying that, I don't know whether it's representative, but the finding is that some people had this ability to solve this problem quickly. And if they did, this is the main point of this, they generalized perfectly when we switched the digits from the candidate set that they'd seen during practice, as in this example here, to another candidate set, which didn't overlap with the candidates used in practice. They did show a slight initial decrement when they were switched from rows to columns or vice versa. But that was, after about 4 trials with the switched configuration, they were basically back to normal in their accuracy, although there was a reaction time, a speed advantage to what they'd already practiced on. So they had a highly transferable skill that they acquired from a limited range of experience. It was also true that being a solver was associated with math education, and also with the fact that most of the solvers could give an explicit explanation of their solution strategy. So my overall take on this kind of task, and I've played a lot of Sudoku contemplating these things myself, is that, when we initially learn something like a new skill like this, or a new sort of mathematical concept that allows us to solve a set of problems of a related type, but with variable different kinds of arguments to the function and different ways of configuring them, we initially work from a relatively explicit representation, which is often communicated to us through instructions. And then, we gradually sort of make it habitual and routinized, and it becomes, more or less automatic, and maybe we would say consolidated into our automatic processing systems that underlie many of the skills we have that we don't think about at all, such as our ability to read our own native language and things like that. So we can ask the question, great, so that's what humans can do if they have sufficient educational background. But what happens if you teach a neural network this same task? We call it the hidden single task, with the same sort of restriction on the range of examples. And Andrew used a model called the recurrent relational network that was used previously to achieve state-of-the-art performance in solving Sudoku puzzles for a neural network, but it had been trained from the full distribution of Sudoku puzzles, right? There was no holdouts of any kind. And when he did the same kind of restriction of the training of that model that he did with our human subjects, it couldn't generalize at all to digits that hadn't been in the set of possible targets that it had as a potential solution candidates. And furthermore, it required, about 1,000 times more training examples than the human solvers did. So much more data required and a failure of generalization. So these are 2 ways in which humans can be more efficient. They can learn with much less data, and they can transfer from a narrow range of experience. Not always, not perfectly. I don't claim we're especially magical in that respect, but it's something to understand. How do we achieve that? So what will it take to achieve this sort of human-like, both the speed of learning and the generalization? Well, one way of thinking about this is that the humans appear to learn an appropriate abstraction. The in-weights learning that our neural networks do appears to suffer from something we might call a hyperspecificity problem. It sort of tunes itself to the distribution of the data and to even the word order of sentences that are presented to it in a language model. The RNN, from Palmadov, the Sudoku model, similarly, only ever considered as its candidate solution digits the ones that were actually targets for it as teaching. And so it got gradient signals saying, make me the answer. And that made it very specific, right? It learned this is one of the possible answers, but not, necessarily the general principle, the abstract rule that would allow generalization. So the conjecture that I'm offering here in this talk is that AI models, the reason why they need all the extra training data that they require compared to humans is in large part a consequence of this limitation. If you want to know that Mary Lee Pfeiffer is Tom Cruise's model, you have to encounter that data in that order in order to sort of cover the space of possible examples before you would seem intelligent enough to know. Whereas for a human, that may not be true. So one question that we could ask at this point is, well, what about the role of in-context learning? We heard about in-context learning the first day of this conference. And it's interesting to note that the reversal curse really does not occur when new factual information is available in context. I was extremely skeptical of this claim because, it seemed like there should be some specificity to the information in context. But my PhD student, different one, named Jerome Hahn, did this very carefully controlled experiment with lots of different novel, synthetic facts like Brian Smith is the father of Fred Jones. And if you just, with several different large language models, some of them much larger than others. And what he found was, to the extent that the model could get the answer correct in the same sort of ordering of the words as in the information that was stored in context, it could also get it correct in the reverse. Some of the models were better than others overall, but they didn't really care about the ordering of the words. So that was pretty interesting. And I do think it's one of the things that makes large language models smart is that they somehow, what they've learned to do in context is create representations that are a little bit like these more generalizable ones that presumably we're forming in our minds when we're solving these problems. So, rather than thinking that the model has sort of memorized the sequence of words in a literal way, we think about it more in terms of the way we used to think about propositions being represented in good old-fashioned AI, where, there's a relation and there's two arguments to these relations that are typed relations, like the father argument and the son argument, and you can probe this propositional statement with the father or the son to get back the completion of it. In fact, this is a little problem that Jeff Hinton studied in a model of semantic memory that he made in 1981. Yes, Roger.
Just a quick question. Is there a way to verify this for something non-parametric? So I wonder whether like a retrieval system would also not suffer from this specificity problem. And then that's what really is happening within context. It's really acting as a retrieval mechanism somehow. So I wonder like whether one can engineer an experiment where instead of having a parametric model that learn with gradient descent, you have something like a k-nearest neighbor with the right distance metric and see whether that suffers. And if that is the behavior that we're seeing here, rather than the right
Yeah,
abstractions.
that's very similar to my own theory about what we want, and I'll be getting to something close to that very soon. Yeah, great. You're right on target with me here. If you can represent this in context, maybe you could take whatever that thing is, whatever that stuff is in the in context state, and like put that in a memory somewhere. That's actually a little bit tricky because where is it is hard to say, right? So, but people work on that problem, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now is the question, how can we go from active state information in context? That's what we have somehow in the LLM. We have this set of patterns of activity in the context window of the model. How can we go from that, something that works pretty well and generalizes a lot better than stuff that's in weights, to a situation where we have robust knowledge in the weights of our network? And so that's sort of the question, the quest of this work that I'm describing to you here. I'm going to tell you about this in the context of a theory that I learned about from a man named Bruce McNaughton. It was originally introduced by David Marr when he was a computational neuroscientist before he was an AI researcher. He spent several years writing a set of 3 huge authoritative papers about the learning systems in the brain. One was the cerebellum, one was the neocortex, the thin sheet of neurons that lies on the surface and in the sulci near the surface of the brain, and the archicortex, the ancient cortex, which is otherwise known as the hippocampus. And his theory was that the neocortex is a gradual learning system, and the hippocampus, the archicortex, the ancient cortex, is a simple, fast learning system that memorizes specific patterns. And I heard about this theory. It made tremendous amount of sense to me, and I sort of brought it into the deep learning era, or the, I guess you would say, the pre-deep learning sort of connectionist neural network era in the 1990s with Bruce McNaughton and a PhD student of mine at that time. So let me just go over the basic idea here. So the idea is that connections within and among neocortical areas, those are the ones shown here in green, support the gradual acquisition of structured knowledge through a process which I described as interleaved learning, which essentially is what we do when we train large models, large neural networks with batches and batches of training data. Even if we never get the same data twice, you know, for example, in language models, certain sentences are repeating, words are occurring many, many times. There's some basic pattern structure in that data that we're gradually learning to use and to cope with, to make better predictions of future words and to implicitly solve tasks in context. And this is what we attribute to this slow learning system in the neocortex. Then there's a rapid learning system in the connections within the hippocampus, which is deep inside the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobes of your brain are these lobes that are coming down like this towards the front of the brain. And deep inside there, near the medial surface on both sides of the brain, there's a hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a place where there's extremely large well, there's a lot of plasticity. There's a huge amount of certain kind of neuroreceptors that allow for very rapid plastic changes in synapses. And so the idea is that when we learn something new, something for the first time in some specific situation, we're learning it in the hippocampus. And then bidirectional connections between the hippocampus and the cortex, which I'm showing here with these heavier blue arrows, are allowing the system to, they're necessary for propagating the information in there for storage, but also for retrieval and pattern completion later, okay? So that's basically the complementary learning systems theory. Now, why would one imagine that this could possibly be true? Well, if it turned out that there was a patient named HM who had his hippocampus removed from his brain on both sides of the brain to as an attempt to cure his intractable epilepsy. And basically he retained his ability to speak his native language, his ability to do basic skills like arithmetic and skills that he'd acquired in school, his knowledge of the repeated facts about the world, like, who was the president of the United States during the period of his childhood and things like that. But he could not learn anything new. It was a really, really profound deficit. And he also lost knowledge for information that you would have been expected to have acquired over the time leading up to his surgery. For example, he had no idea that he had been scheduled to have this surgery. Completely no idea at all. So his recent knowledge and his ability to learn new things was lost, as if this was where it was stored and would have been stored if he still had a hippocampus. Okay, so I think there's a lot of biological support for this basic view. And we've had this idea with this model for a very long time that the hippocampus is there to allow you to learn new things quickly. And even if you're only exposed to them once, if you can replay them, interleaving them with ongoing exposure to other things, then you can gradually acquire this new knowledge without producing catastrophic interference. So it's a part of the solution to the continual learning problem. And so we're going to work within the context of this theory and thinking about these issues that we are talking about here today. So I'm going to try to connect these ideas briefly to multimodal AI models. Many of you probably know more about these models than I do, so you can help me out. But they're moving in a direction which is one that I like, which is that many of them are becoming multimodal. And I think obviously we need to be able to gather information from multimodalities and form sort of, an integrated understanding of the information that's coming to us, combining over multiple input streams. So for simplicity, I'm going to imagine that we just have two input streams. And I'm also going to imagine that they come sort of chunked into sentence image pairs, like maybe in a cartoon comic book or something where there's a bunch of sequential images and a sentence with each one. And the idea is that, HM would be able to read this comic book, right? He'd be able to sort of combine the information from the pictures and the words to sort of come up with an understanding of what was in this image. So he's sort of forming some integrated embedding across these two input modalities. And that's kind of like his understanding of the current situation. And he could answer a reasonable question about that, like who's wearing a red hat, or what did the person say the other person's mother was, or something. And he could answer those kinds of questions. The only problem was if, he read through a sequence of 10 of these, even if they made a continuous story, after a while, he'd only have a very small sense of the immediate recent context and would have lost the broader context of the whole story. There have been good studies of that with other amnesic patients recently. So the idea then is that this this language model like thing, at least in the human brain, it's a multimodal model, I guess we'd call it, would hold on to a few recent embeddings in sort of an active working memory state. But anything that it needed that was beyond this short immediate context, and the estimates of its span are, if you maintain something specific, you can maintain that specific thing indefinitely, as long as you kind of like keep it active, right? So it's not like it's specifically time limited, but as soon as you shift your attention, it sort of fades out over maybe 20 seconds or something like that. So that's what, the working memory state or the context window is in the neocortex of the human brain. And anything else, anything older than like 20 seconds, we need our hippocampus to retrieve. So our hippocampus is actually an extension of our immediate working memory that is extremely important for context beyond a few seconds, essentially. And so, like as Razvan's question, what we're doing is we're essentially storing what we've understood in context in a way that we can retrieve it from this medial temporal lobe-like system. Okay? All right. So here's my plan for the rest of the talk. I'm going to briefly tell you about a proposal we've been working on for what this human-like fast learning system in the medial temporal lobe. Medial temporal lobe is, just another word for the part of the brain where the hippocampus sits, or what Mark called archicortex. What this system might be like, and I'm going to be building on what's called the modern Hopfield network, which I'll introduce you to in a minute. Then I'm going to return to the problem of the hyperspecificity of in-weights learning and consider a recent project we've been doing in my lab to try to overcome this hyperspecificity problem. And I'll conclude by suggesting that continued work on these kinds of threads might contribute to achieving human-like efficient cumulative and continual learning as a model of the human cognitive system, but also as a better AI system. Who knows? A lot more work will be required. I'm not solving the problem here today. But this next bit will give you a little bit of a flavor of some aspects of my thinking, and it actually goes back to some aspects of Marr's original ideas from his 1969 paper on his theory of simple memory in the hippocampus. Interestingly enough, this incarnation of it is called the modern Hopfield net. So what I'd like to ask you to do first is to imagine a sequence of vectors that are stored as successive states. You could imagine they're the states of the context window of GPT-3 or something like that, which might have had a context window of 4,024 or 12,000, whatever, successive states. So there'll be a vector for each of those previous states. And we kind of imagine they're in slots, right? The entire stack of the transformer is in all of the data from that stack of the transformer, all the activation states are all there in the context for querying. But we just imagine a single vector instead of a whole stack of them at each position. So we have a vector for the previous items in context. Or we could store those vectors offline in a big disk somewhere, and we'd query them with probes, okay? And we're going to imagine that these vectors are represented by these feature neurons here. The diagram, this is from Krotov and Hopfield's paper, is showing only 5 neurons, but that vector might be, I don't know, 1024 or 496 or whatever, long, a feature vector that we've stored in a slot. So the modern Hopfield network replaces this idea of a slot with a vector in it with the idea of a neuron whose connection weights from the feature units into the neuron and back from the neuron to the feature neuron are both just that vector. Okay, so instead of storing the vector in a slot, you store it in the weights coming into and back out of a neuron. Now, I'm going to get to a relaxation of that idea, but it's a useful bridge to what might go on in the brain, because we don't really think the brain has like slots, right? At least I don't. And so we're going to start with this idea and then come up with something that is an even more brain-like model building off of these ideas of hop fields. One of the crucial things about this model, which is why it's called a hop field network, is that the connection weights are bidirectionally symmetric. So that means this model has a Lyapunov function. It settles to fixed points. If you present, so what they do in the Krotov and hop field type work, they present a normalized vector of unit length, which might exactly match a previous memory, but might just be a subset of the elements of that memory or a distorted version of a memory. And then they just iterate this process of presenting this vector, sending it through the weights to the hidden neurons, applying a softmax across those neurons or some other highly steep, function that sort of selects the best matching neurons, and then sending back a weighted vector across all the memories, each of the weights being the softmax value that was assigned. So the best matching neurons send back the strongest signal, and those with lesser matches in the softmax send back weaker signals, and you just get a composite vector back, okay? So this is called the modern hop field network, and it's actually very, very analogous to the query key value operation in a transformer, except that any part of this vector could be thought of as the query. Any part of the stored memories can be thought of as the corresponding keys, and all the rest of the stored memory can be thought of as the value that's being retrieved. So it's a omnidirectional, content addressable memory. Okay, instead of being, okay, this is the key and this is the value returned, it's like anything could be the key and anything else could be the return. So that would work great for if we had a representation that somehow had parts of it that corresponded to the neurons that represent the father of part, and another bunch that corresponded to the son part of that relation, and then another part that corresponded to the relation. We could query with this guy is the father in a father-son relation, who's the son, and vice versa, right? Okay, so also very similar to Mar's original idea, except that Mar didn't think that we allocated single neurons to individual memories. One of his brilliant insights in that part of his career was to propose that a sparse distributed representation could solve the problem without requiring a dedicated neuron for each memory. And we're going to use that idea. So this slide is a little complicated, but I'm going to first of all set up a slight extension of the model we've talked about so far, and then talk about this multi-neuron version, which we call the K-winner modern hop field network. So first of all, we're going to say, we're going to stipulate that we're dealing with a system that has a fixed capacity. We don't add new memory neurons. And we're also going to think about it as, so let's say we just have 100. In simple experiments, we could use 100. We imagine that each of these neurons is fully connected bidirectionally to all the elements of our feature vector. And we consider this in a steady state situation where previous experiences have already come in and all the memory neurons have been used by some previous experiences. So now when a new memory comes in, we're going to have to do some overwriting of previous memories. So where are we going to put this new memory? Which neuron are we going to reuse? And we're going to use a very simple idea here, which is a very common one, which is basically the best, the neurons that match the current input to be learned best are the ones that we're going to tune up to match it even better. This idea was, von der Malsberg, Grossberg, many people way back in the earliest days of neural network research proposed ideas like this. In fact, the modern Hopfield network is extremely similar to Steve Grossberg's early models of learning that he proposed in the 60s. And then what we're going to do in our baseline model here is we're going to imagine that this new memory replaces the old memory by simply just writing its vector into the bidirectional weights in one go. Perfect replacement of whatever was there before. Okay, so that's a straw man baseline model. And then we're going to relax several elements of that. Okay, so most of these ideas are in accord with Marr's ideas. Each memory neuron has connections with only a fraction of the input neurons. So the hippocampus, the neurons in the hippocampus can't see all the input neurons. Each neuron only sees a subset. So you wouldn't be able to store the whole pattern in a single neuron. They just don't cover the entire input. So we're going to imagine that each memory neuron sees a fraction f of the input vector. But we're going to conserve the same total number of connections. So if f is 0.5, we're going to have twice as many hidden units because that means the total number of connections is the same between our baseline model and our relaxed version, okay? So then what we're going to imagine is that we're going to need to select some subset of these neurons in order to make sure we've got enough coverage of this new input vector to store the new memory. And we don't have an exact closed form solution to exactly what the best number for K is, but we experimented around with it. And in the case where, F is 0.5, K of about 5, or 2.5% of the 200 neurons is about enough to be pretty sure you've covered all the input features of the current input. They're the ones that get most strongly activated. So we choose the K nearest neighbors as this sort of ensemble representation of an item. And then we update the weights with an incremental learning rule. We don't completely overwrite all the weights in these K nearest neighbors. Or this sort of collection of K items that forms the nearest neighbor representation. We update them in such a way that the pattern is distributed over these neurons and older memories are still partially in there. So we use an epsilon of 0.3 in our baseline, in our comparisons here. And so we have a small scale version of this, which has an input dimension of 100, an F of 0.5. So that means 200 hidden neurons and a K of 5. And we compare that to the fully connected original model with F of 1, essentially an update parameter of 1. So the old memory is completely replaced. And yeah, that's about it. Okay, so, and then we have a scaled up version of the model where the input dimension is 1,000, F is 0.05. So each neuron is still seeing 50 input elements of the input, but that's a much smaller fraction of the total amount. So K has to be larger for coverage, and that means that we have a much larger number of hidden neurons. So a memory is represented by still 2.5% of the hidden neurons. It's still a sparse representation. And I want to get back to the rest of the story, so I'm going to be brief here, but the basic finding is, the modern Hopfield network is perfectly storing the most recent memory that you just stuck in it. And as long as that one hasn't been overwritten, it's available for retrieval. But if the memories, and we're testing these things with IID, completely random vectors in the experiments I'm showing here with absolutely no structure whatsoever. And so what happens there is it's extremely predictable in the baseline model. The next pattern has 1 chance in 100 of selecting a neuron that already has a pattern in it. Once it's selected that pattern is just gone. It's not available at all anymore. And so you get a nice exponential decay of the memories. They're either there or they're not, and it's completely exponential. On the other hand, in the K-winner model, the first pattern isn't even perfectly stored because there's a little bit of noisiness in this process, but the memories persist for much longer. And so there's a very long tail of the memory's retention of previous experience. And so that's what the red curves are. The K-winner model wins for the very first few patterns, but after a while, the one-winner model wins for the very first immediately seen pattern over the more distributed model. But after only a few patterns, the advantage of the other model starts to show up, and it has a much longer retention tail. And this advantage is expanded dramatically in the scaled up model, so that its capacity, its tendency to retain at least something about an old memory lasts much, much longer than the original model with these Hopfield model with these 1 neuron per memory. Not to claim that anybody ever thought the original model was really a good model, but just to show that this distributed model has some potential advantages, and it captures some things that neuroscientists have argued, and Marr computationally inspired, as well as knowing a little bit about the neuroscience that was available at the time, also drew on in his early work. So this model is far from perfect, but there is one other little experiment we did with it that I want to mention briefly, because I think it's relevant to understanding another potential advantage of this sort of averaging process that goes on in this model, which is that, if a new memory is extremely similar to something that was previously stored, it'll be very likely to recruit more or less the same neurons and then sort of update the representation of essentially that thing. But if it's quite different from anything else, it's going to sort of recruit a much more random ensemble of neurons that come from many different memories. And it will be a little harder to retain, of course, because all the other knowledge that's already in there will be interfering with it. But if you got a few repetitions of that, you'd be able to store that novel thing, and any other thing that was unrelated to it would still be in there, because it would be mostly in other weights elsewhere. So I think it's got some properties which we have to consider as part of a robust system. And even more importantly, it avoids the idea that memories have to be stuck in specific slots or that they have to be allocated to individual neurons. Instead, they're distributed over populations of neurons, which makes sense to me from a brain style perspective. Okay. I think I covered most of what's on this slide. So we're now ready to go back to what I consider the harder problem of getting the neocortical in-weights learning to be able to learn somehow at this more abstract level to support out of distribution generalization. You could consider that to be a little bit of an aside if you wanted. I couldn't repress the urge to include it in the talk, so I kept it. And hopefully we have a little time for this next part of our recent work that was inspired by the Sudoku work and builds on it. So we could consider this work to be asking the question, is it possible for in-weights learning to overcome the hyperspecificity problem? But we studied this in a cumulative curriculum-like setting, examining whether this hyperspecificity could be avoided when we're learning to compose previously acquired skills. So when I talk about cumulative learning, I'm talking about the idea that, we might learn, to count before we learn to add, and we start learning to add by essentially extending the process of counting. Like if you want to add 2 to 3, you count up from 3 by 1 more and then 2 more. So 1 more makes 4, 2 more makes 5. So we're building on previous skills as we acquire new ones. And, can we compose previous component skills to learn a new skill, like the hidden single strategy that we walked through before? So we're going to have 2 component strategies that I'll introduce you to in a minute, which can be composed in order to solve the hidden single task. And in previous work, we were successful if we interleaved. So in training a model with a narrow range of examples, okay, and getting out of distribution generalization, we succeeded in that by interleaving this narrow range of examples of the hidden task with ongoing exposure to all of the full data distribution of the 2 background trials. So that's extremely costly, both in terms of storage. You have to have all those background trials to replay, and compute. You have to keep computing all those background trials while you're doing this interleaved learning. And this project that I'm about to tell you now is asking the question, can we do without all that replay and get the same out of distribution generalization? Okay, so that's the challenge. And we started a little late, so I don't know, 10 more minutes? And yeah, okay. Hopefully I can get the basic points across, and we'll have time for a little bit of general discussion. So the tasks that we teach the model are called the full house task, and then the can contain task. And these 2 tasks can be composed to solve the hidden single task. We use a 6x6 instead of a 9x9 Sudoku board with only 6 digits, and boxes are 3x2. So each 3x2 box has to, and each row and column in the solution has to contain exactly 1 instance of all 6 digits. And we essentially give the model a specific board state, candidate cell, candidate digit, and a task specification. And we then walk it through the sequence of solving the puzzle using this, using essentially teacher forcing in a transformer to teach it to go through these steps. So for the full house task, there's a startup sequence token, full house token, goal cell token, row 2, column 2, house type box, digit 4. The question is, can you determine that a 4 must go in that box? And this strategy is a little less sophisticated than the hidden single strategy. It just asks whether all the other cells are filled, and this digit isn't one of the ones that's already there. So it walks through these things, and if the cell is filled, then you say no. It is not filled, you say no. If it is filled, you say yes. And they all have to be filled with a digit other than this one before you would ever say yes. So in this case, there's some empty cells. And so the answer is no. 4 is not the solution. So that's the full house task. So it knows how to iterate through all the cells of a house and ask a question that then gets composed together to be the answer to the final answer to the question, to the query in the task. The can contain task is the extension of this that's necessary for the full house. This applies when you get to a cell. If it's empty, you ask, could this cell contain this digit? And if there's already an instance of the digit in the row, column, or box anywhere else, the answer is no, it can't contain it. And the answer to the can contain question has to be no before for all the cells before the answer is yes. So that's the hidden single strategy. Okay, so we train the model with the full data distribution of the full house strategy, so it knows all the digits. Obviously, if you've never seen a digit before, you wouldn't be able to generalize out a distribution. So it seems like that's relevant background. And then we do that for 40K weight updates. Each update is a batch of about 128 problems, I think, something like that. And then it gets the can contain task for 30,000 net bucks. And then it gets the hidden single task with a restricted data distribution. Okay, so the first two tasks come from the full data distribution. So we're setting things up so it should be fairly easy because it knows how to use all the digits in all the cells to ask all the questions. And it's just a matter of composing previously thought strategies. So now we give it the hidden singles task. And while we're teaching it this hidden singles task with a restricted range of data, we test it on the held out. So for example, in this case, we restricted the data by holding out 2 digits, as illustrated in this particular figure. And the held out examples all involve target digits, which are the other 2 digits. Okay. So that's the setup. And we looked at 4 different degrees of holdouts here. So the 2-digit holdout, I mentioned 4-digit holdout. We just train with 2 candidate digits. The 4-digit and house holdout, here you hold out 4 digits and you hold out a whole box type from the training data. So it's learning like the human subjects did, let's say with columns and not with rows or vice versa. Okay, so going to skip over this, but there's a baseline transformer model is a 3-layer model with, it turns out it's got 700,000 parameters. So it feels like a lot of parameters somehow, but it's each layer of the attention has a dimension of 90s, and it's got 6 heads. So each head is a relatively small width. And so it's a relatively small scale transformer with 3 layers deep. It first sees all the cells in the board, and then it's stepped through the prompt part of the question, and it auto-regressively generates, during testing, it auto-regressively generates tokens. During training, it's teacher forced with the right set of tokens to step through the solution. Okay. All right. So in the baseline model, it can learn the full task. So it's not only it doesn't have the capacity to learn the full task if it's given the whole data distribution, and it learns the restricted data distribution very well. So it can do that too. It's just that it doesn't generalize. So for example, even in the 2-digit generalization, the median solution accuracy is only 58%, where 50% is basically around chance. So it's not really doing very well on the held out digits. So how can we improve this? Well, first thing we thought of was a larger transformer dimension. And but I wanted to imagine that the network needed more representational capacity, but it didn't necessarily need more weights. So what we did was we asked whether we could get by with the same number of weights by essentially sharing the weights across the 3 levels of the transformer. So when you scale up the transformer dimension from 90 to 252, but you share them across all the layers, you end up with roughly the same number of weights in the model as a whole. And then we compared that to the case where it actually did have all those extra weights because they weren't shared across the layers of the transformer. We made some small representation and architecture adjustments. They do matter, and the reason I'm telling you about the fact that we did those things is just to say that I do think that sometimes the choices we make of representations and architectures really deserve some consideration. It's not just all scale. I don't want to claim that anything specifically we did here is important, but I just would like to say that those are relevant issues, and we can talk about the details if you're interested. So skipping over that. So what happens when we consider these different things? Well, actually, with everything that I've said so far, we got to the point that at least with this 2 holdout digits, it got 96%, 6.5% correct on the held out task. However, there's a catch. It always then degraded its own performance because kept trying to do better, and it started producing interference. So if we kept running it, it would lose that peak performance. So somehow or other, the network has within it this capacity to learn something that generalizes. That's kind of the magic to me. But it also eventually overfits, right? So that's a good start. And I'm going to skip over the second experiment with the 4 held out digits and go on to the hardest one, which holds out a whole house type as well. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping a little bit. But in order to sort of ameliorate this problem of the subsequent overfitting after the peak, we used synaptic intelligence, which is like elastic weight consolidation. And again, I'm going to skip over the details in the interest of time, but that is a model that conserves the weights that solved the previous tasks so that and leaves the ones that hadn't been important for that free to be learned to do the new task. So what happens with synaptic intelligence is it prevents the overfitting, but it also facilitates finding the solution that generalizes even better. That's what you're supposed to see from this graph. This is with one of those previous runs that, you know, some of the models did pretty well. These are 3 different seeds that you're looking at here. So in this case, one of the 3 seeds without synaptic intelligence did quite well. The next one did okay, and the next one a little worse. They all fell off and overfit. With synaptic intelligence, all 3 completely solved the problem. So we're using synaptic intelligence for something other than what people usually use it for. We're not just using it to hold on to previous information. We're using it to support out of distribution generalization. Okay, so that's an important difference between this and other work using this method. And I think, you know, it's useful to ask the question. There's a brief mention of this in the original synaptic intelligence paper that, gee, you know, it also learned the new tasks a little bit better with the synaptic intelligence than without in some cases. And so that's sort of a little bit of generalization evidence from previous work. But this, we're calling a bit more attention to that here. Okay, so once you add synaptic intelligence, you get, you know, we got these results. We realized we were up against the ceiling with this 2-digit holdout. So we went to a stronger holdouts to continue the experiments. And I'm going to quickly go over this result we have here. So when we held out 4 digits and one of the house types, like a row or a column, and we included our architectural and representational refinements, we got a situation where 10 out of 10 seeds produced 100% OOT accuracy, and they still kind of sometimes degraded a little bit. So this is just peak, right? So the peak, there's noise in it. it's not like it's necessarily even degrading actually, because the peak, it's got to be bigger than the mean if there's noise. So anyway, the point is that with these things in place, we actually got really amazing results in terms of this out of distribution generalization, and it was a lot faster. Somehow or other, we only needed 104 batches instead of, you know, like order 1,000 in other cases in order to achieve this strong result. So that's kind of my take-home message here. Just this brief aside, which is that what our representation and architectural changes did was it made it so that, you know, it was much more reliable across the 10 seats. So we've just graphed the final accuracy for all 10 seeds in the order of increasing final accuracy, just to give you the sense that, you know, 8 of these did extremely well and the other 2 were still in the 90s. Without those refinements, a few of the seeds didn't quite get there. So something about the architecture helps align things to promote abstraction. And I think we ought to think about that because having architectures that promote abstraction is going to be useful in achieving efficient cumulative learning. Okay, so here's my final slide. These results show that networks can achieve strong out of distribution generalization of in-weights learning. Learning can also be relatively fast, requiring relatively few examples to achieve high accuracy. Together, these 2 improvements are dramatically improving our learning efficiency. Okay, we both have fewer examples to learn the task, and even with the narrow distribution, and very broad out of distribution generalization together with that. So that's what I guess I mean by efficient learning. Those 2 things together. Of course, we've got a long way to go before we achieve 100,000-fold increases in data efficiency to equal our human participants, or to achieve anything like these kinds of results in other models, which I'm sure, you know, once we get to really large models, that'll be hard to do. And I'm not sure these same results will hold. I don't know. But perhaps by combining further research on this and using our hippocampus-like memory for representations formed in context with this more efficient kind of in-weights integration, using some of the kinds of ideas that I've shared with you here, we could begin to make progress towards achieving this human-like efficient, cumulative, and continual learning for our artificial systems as well as our human brains. Thank you.
Okay, we have time just for one question, I'm afraid.
Yeah, thank you for the nice talk. Just quickly, like the results in the second half, was that with your own model or transformer?
These results here that I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, this was with a transformer.
Okay. So this didn't, like there was and did you try your own model? Because I thought that you were going there and try to propose to use your own model that you, or the own layer that you propose.
Oh, well, that was what I meant by the architectural refinement. It made some difference. It made the model more robust, and I didn't say what it was, but I skipped over that side, but essentially I could show it to you here. It basically involved separating the key query and value weights for the board from the key query and value weights that are used within the token sequence of the solution process itself. So by separating those things from each other, there's, you know, a separate sort of way we have of querying the visual world than the way we have of querying our language sequence, our sequence of steps in our internal thought process. That was the that was the refinement. It made a certain amount of difference. It made the models, generally made them more robust, more likely to succeed in these different simulations. For example, here, it was, when you left that out, it still did pretty well. That would be that second row. But it still required twice as much time and wasn't as robust.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure that Shay will still be available for discussions during the coffee break, lunch break, whatever. And I'm sure there will still be a lot of follow-up discussions. Let's thank him again. And then we move on to the next oral session. So I would like to ask the speakers to make sure they're logged in to the Zoom session to have a smooth transition. Before we go there, 2 announcements. The dinner tonight will be at 8 p.m. In the program, at some point it was mentioned 7 p.m. So it's 8 p.m. Don't show up an hour early. Second announcement, we'll have a panel session this later today. For that, in the Slack, there's a place where you can propose questions. And so you can also like questions posed by others. And so we will use that as a basis for the discussion during the panel session. So please go and check out the Slack and give us some input to have the panel session later today.